When Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 4 came out in 2016, it had been about 2.5 years since the previous game in the series, that being Into the Nexus, and up to that point, that was the franchise's longest break. RNC only had one entry on PS4 however, and it would take over 5 years until the next one, which is double the break time. That game is of course Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart for the PlayStation 5. It was revealed on June 11th of 2020 and released on that same date in 2021. Both the reveal and the release happened only a day after I finished my first and second years of university, and only a day before my 21st and 22nd birthdays, so both instances gave me plenty of reasons to celebrate. Even so, there was also reason to worry about the end product, because while I had no doubt that the gameplay and visuals would be fantastic, the writing and music hasn't exactly been all that good for the RNC games this past decade. In fact, those games weren't all that good in general, at least not compared to the best of the best, and although I found much enjoyment in both Into the Nexus and the PS4 installment, they left much to be desired. Because of this, I've been more cautiously optimistic about this entry than with prior ones, where I had nothing but hype. Back in November on Ratchet & Clank's 18th anniversary, I ranked all the video games in the franchise, and I made a prediction that Rift Apart would end up being my 7th favorite RNC, in front of Into the Nexus, but behind Deadlocked. Now that I've finally played Rift Apart, is that where it actually lands, or do I like it more or less than that? That's what I'm here to answer as I review the game, leaving no stone unturned, so to those who haven't had the chance to play this one yet, beware of spoilers.
We're going to a dimension where I always win, so you can finally know how it feels!
The story of Rift Apart takes place after Into the Nexus and finally resolves that cliffhanger of Clank grabbing the Dimensionator that's been hanging for nearly 8 years. You see, he's actually fixed the device, giving it to Ratchet as a gift, so that he'll be able to search for his lost race, the Lombaxes. Ratchet seems conflicted about it, but before being able to express that, Dr. Nefarious swoops in and steals the Dimensionator, finding a dimension where he always wins, so that he can finally know the feeling. The Dimensionator goes haywire after Ratchet shoots it, causing interdimensional chaos around the universes. This also leads to Ratchet and Clank separating, and Clank is soon taken by Rivet, who's a female Lombax from another dimension. A bunch of developments unfold from this, but the ultimate goal is to stop Nefarious and achieve dimensional stability.
Well, maybe you could be. If you'd stopped to help me that night instead of running away, things could have been different. Or if you just told the truth, maybe...
Why do none of you understand? I am broken. I will always be broken.
The writing of Ratchet and Clank games from the last decade wasn't very good, especially in Full Frontal Assault and the PS4 game, the latter being the last release before Rift Apart, so that aspect was my biggest worry for this game. Fortunately, Rift Apart has way better writing than either of those, which was such a relief to find out. That being said, it doesn't really come close to the original 4 RNC games on the PS2 in that regard, nor A Crack in Time on the PS3. It's not far off from Tools of Destruction though. I found the setup for the story quite interesting, with Clank fixing the Dimensionator for Ratchet, and Ratchet being conflicted about that. It finally resolves the annoying cliffhanger from Into the Nexus, and Ratchet's reaction to it makes sense for his character, given that he's been hesitant to find the Lombaxes after learning of how dangerous it can be to use such powerful devices, and feeling like he already has a family, namely Clank and Talwyn, maybe even Quark. Talwyn actually isn't in this game, unless you count the credits, which I'm honestly fine with, because I never really found her all that interesting, and the writers didn't want to continue her storyline of finding Max Apogee anyway, at least not yet. I will say that it was pretty stupid of Clank to present the Dimensionator to Ratchet in public, and as a grand event at that. He should have expected a villain to show up, and given how prepared Dr. Nefarious was with his plans to jump dimensions, the surprise must have already been revealed to the public for some reason. Yeah, that's right, Nefarious is the main villain again, which annoyed me quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, Nephi is one of my favorite characters in the series, and he's at his peak in Up Your Arsenal and A Crack in Time. That's the thing though, he hasn't been at his peak since, and while he's been a fun character, he has become a bit stale for my liking. Also, didn't he grow a soft spot for Ratchet, Clank and Quark in All for One? Because of that, I thought for sure we were dealing with an alternate dimension Nefarious, but apparently not. Before the game came out, Marcus Smith even said, "The Butler did it," so I was wondering if Lawrence had maybe reprogrammed Nefarious or something to return him to his former self, but he was gone for the whole game due to having a kid. Maybe that's what the butler did it meant. That is a funny joke, but I wish Lawrence had been a part of the game, because Nefarious is always at his best when his butler is around. That's why his best portrayals were in Uppy Arsenal and A Crack in Time, and I feel like he can't reach that peak again unless he's got Lawrence to complement him. I am however glad that Dr. Nefarious' alternate dimension version Emperor Nefarious kind of did complement our Nefarious, by being far more competent and serious. Even then, he still jokes around, only more sarcastically, not on the level of Lawrence, but I found him refreshing after the obnoxiousness of Dr. Nefarious. His introduction was really good, silencing a bunch of civilians and casually throwing the heroes around, and he continued to prove his competency by getting rid of the Resistance members. He's by no means my favorite villain in the series, but I liked him, and he served the interdimensional theme well. Because of him, I'm actually not too bothered that Dr. Nefarious returned, and it kind of felt like Phineas and Ferb across the second dimension, which by the way is my favorite animated movie. Of course, I much prefer how that movie dealt with an interdimensional story, but at least Rift Apart also had a duet between the two mad geniuses. This duet plays during the credits, and I was overjoyed to hear it. It had been a wish of mine with this game, and it delivered. I do much prefer the duet between the two doofs, but the Nef duet is a treat as well. I mentioned the Resistance, but haven't explained what it actually is. It's a movement against Emperor Nefarious, and consists of characters such as Phantom, Captain Quantum, and Rivet. Phantom is alternate dimension Skid McMarx, which makes sense considering Skid calls himself Shadow Dude in Uppy Arsenal, and while he's definitely not as lovable as Skid from that game, I still liked Phantom. Unlike in RNC PS4, Skid wasn't overbearing, he was actually pretty low-key, and that made him cool. He's got some good lines too, such as
"Enemy can't catch what doesn't temporarily exist,"
and
tearing this whole rotten world down from the inside.
It might not be peak Skid, but I'm really glad he wasn't cringeworthy this time around, which could have easily been the case. Maybe it would have if regular Skid was more prominent, but he wasn't, which was probably for the best. Captain Quark actually didn't have much screen time either, which is probably because his original voice actor, Jim Ward, retired due to some serious health conditions. I will most definitely miss his performance. He did play my favorite video game character after all, but I hope Jim will get better because of this. It's kind of hard to live up to that role, and the new voice doesn't sound quite right, so it was for the best that Quark was kept to a minimum. Captain Quark also has an alternate dimension version in this game, and he's called Captain Quantum. He didn't do much either, but I quite liked him, and he had a nice mini-arc of becoming a hero, after hearing that Quark is a hero, despite all the shit he's done. I like to imagine that line was meant to commemorate Jim Ward as well, who truly was a voice acting hero. Rusty Pete of all characters also had an alternate dimension version, named Pierre Lefer, pirate/gentleman extraordinaire. He was perhaps a bit talkative, but still enjoyable to watch and listen to. Regular Rusty Pete basically didn't do anything, and I find it odd that he was at the ceremony celebrating Ratchet and Clank, considering his history with them. Oh well, it was a way to involve the space pirates again, which I grew to appreciate. Then there's Rivet, who's pretty much the actual main character of this game, and I like her quite a bit. She's very kind and cutesy, but also smug and hard-headed, and she has some interesting developments throughout the story. One of her gimmicks is that she doesn't trust most robots. That's because for one, pretty much every robot she encounters works for Nefarious, and two, she lost her arm because of one of Nefarious's warbots. Even so, she grows to trust Clank, after he proves himself trustworthy, and they quickly become buddies. That might seem like the rushed friendship building between Ratchet and Clank in the PS4 game, but at least here there was some strife between them at first. Besides, Rivet's rocky relationship is saved for another wholesome little robot buddy. I'm of course referring to Clank's alternate dimension counterpart, named KT7461, but you can call her Kit. Kit is actually my favorite character in this game, because first of all, she's adorable and wholesome, and secondly, she's also a merciless killing machine, making her very interesting. She's definitely inspired by the Iron Giant, losing control while in combat mode, but I really like that movie, so I like the similarity. It was really easy to sympathize with Kit, given her insecurities, and the fact that she's so small and adorable, much like Clank. She also surprised me when she talked back to Rivet, getting mad and telling her that no one gets her, and she doesn't even apologize. That would normally be annoying, but I felt for Kit at that point, as well as Rivet. That's not even the extent to their conflict. It was quite eye-opening to learn that it was actually Kit who severed Rivet's arm. It made for an interesting connection, and led to some understandable conflict between them, which eventually got resolved. This relationship actually reminded me of how Ratchet and Clank built their bond in the original, so I appreciated that Insomniac actually had the guts to retread such risky grounds again, even though they probably wouldn't admit that. It made for a more realistic development. I also liked that Rivet thought Ratchet's reluctance to find the Lombaxes was ridiculous, given that she doesn't have the same experience as him in that regard, and that also led to a bit of conflict, albeit brief. It's cool that this game set up Rivet and Kit over the course of the story, and I bet they'll be mainstays, unlike most female characters in the series. Considering that the squad has a functional Dimensionator, the discussion about whether to search for the Lombaxes, Ratchet warming up to the idea, and the Lombaxes apparently being scattered throughout different dimensions, I think the next game will be about Ratchet and Clank and Rivet and Kit traveling between dimensions to search for Lombaxes. The credits even show them jump through a dimension in the end, which seems to clearly set up a premise like that. I'd love for that to be the case, and while some might have been disappointed by the lack of that in Rift Apart, I like this game for having set up this new dynamic duo and resolving Ratchet's fear of meeting the Lombaxes. It feels like a more natural progression into the real meat of the saga. Even though we didn't look for the Lombaxes in this game, there was still some Lombax lore to be had. After finding these so-called Lorbs, you can listen to recordings of a Lombax named Mags, who's been instructed by Ratchet's father Caden to map every dimension. They're pretty fun to listen to, as the Lombax talking has a pleasant voice and he references other PlayStation IPs, like Sly Cooper and Jak and Daxter. Even Knack, baby! I love how this game pays homage to PlayStation history, and this isn't the only way it does that. The last couple of Lorbs shift to a more serious tone, as Mags discovers the reason why he's mapping the dimensions, so that the Lombaxes can flee. That was a nice little turnaround, it gave me feels. Spybots also give some lore, this time related to each level, and they're narrated by Miss Zircon. These are neat and charming, and I actually laughed quite a bit when Miss Zircon talked about Sargasso's history, saying,
"The Gelatonium outpost once belonged to the Kerchu tribe, but they were wiped out when they accidentally misspelled the Emperor's name on their tax returns."
Those poor Kerchu, man. More lore can be found in the menus. They actually brought the Monsterpedia back, which had only been in Go and Commando prior, so about time it returned. I do find it weird that it seems to change the lore behind some of the creatures though, and acknowledges the sheep as Drek. Does that mean the PS4 reboot was canon? I shudder at the thought. I do wish this game had an Insomniac museum, but there's only so much you can do, I suppose. Just imagine what could be done with a museum on the PS5 though. The one in A Crack in Time was already super impressive, and that was on the PS3. I haven't touched much upon Ratchet and Clank themselves, and that might be because they take a back seat, at least Ratchet does. Honestly, I'm not too fond of Ratchet's characterization in this game. I did say I liked Ratchet's reluctance to see the Lombaxes, and I do, but other than that, he seems really off, and that's partly due to his voice acting. I love James Arnold Taylor as Ratchet, but he just sounds really obnoxious in this game compared to previous ones.
Pleasure to meet you, Junkbot! This is Kit!
That wouldn't necessarily reflect his characterization, but it kind of does, as Ratchet seems way too scared at many points throughout this game.
Is that an amoeboid?
It's understandable that he would be frightened by the horror section with Jews, but freaking out about seeing amoeboids feels so out of character, considering how much of a battle-hardened Lombax he is. He generally sounds anxious whenever he talks, and sounds surprised by the most basic things.
Someone put a bounty on us?
Whereas before he would sound a lot calmer.
Will you shut up? We are not gonna die! A billion!
Clank also sounds a little off in his voice acting.
A dimensional pocket? Perhaps a symptom of the Dimensionator's destruction.
But he's still pretty much the same lovable little robot he's always been. I did say he was being dumb in the beginning, but at least he realized that and took responsibility for it. Whereas Clank was mostly keck as usual, Ratchet was kind of cringe. Speaking of which, while I do enjoy a lot of the dialogue, there's still some remnants of cringe from RNC PS4. The Goons for Less, for instance, say things like, and, which is such typical meme humor that'll become outdated soon anyway. It doesn't help that no one shuts up either, meaning there won't be much room for quiet moments, and it often leads to characters talking over one another. I quite like the discussions with Gary, but there are so many unnecessary instances of hand-holding. There is some cheesy dialogue too, but I appreciated the wholesomeness, and while the comedy definitely isn't peak RNC, the game did make me laugh quite a bit. Overall, while I don't think the writing of Rift Apart is among the best the franchise has to offer, I was still pleasantly surprised. The story is well told with interesting arcs folding into one another naturally, and the new characters are quite likable. While there still is a bunch of cringe dialogue and constant talking, it's definitely not as bad as it was in the PS4 game, which is such a relief. Whereas that game is maybe a 3 out of 10 in terms of its writing, Rift Apart's writing is more of a strong 7, so I'm glad it at least managed to be good. Unlike the writing of Rift Apart, I had no doubt in my mind that its gameplay would deliver, and it really did, perhaps even more so than I expected. Probably the biggest improvement is Ratchet's movement, and Rivet's for that matter, which is the best it has ever been. From the moment you start playing, the movement feels so smooth, and the game gradually adds more and more fun traversal options, starting with the Rift Tether. It basically lets you fast travel to nearby positions, and looks so cool doing it, thanks to the PS5's quick loading SSD, aka solid state drive. It's kind of similar to the swing shot, which of course makes a return yet again, and while I'm sad that I still can't swing around with it looking like a maniac, it does feel really good to pull off. It later gets an upgrade called the hurl shot, which spins you around a target until you've accumulated enough of a boost to launch yourself across great distances. It's a minor adjustment, but a cool one nonetheless. There's also the Phantom Dash, which is fittingly given to you by the Phantom himself, and it pretty much replaces long jumps, as Clank's helipack can't do that anymore, which I found out at first, but it makes sense in retrospect. This dash works well for traversal, and doubles as a dodging mechanism, which even repels enemy attacks, since it faces you out of existence for a bit. It adds quite a bit to the combat, and it's so mesmerizing to look at. It also allows you to wall run, which both looks and feels nice. Unlike in other games, Ratchet can actually sprint, and it's quite handy early on. It's something the beginning of A Crack in Time could have used, because while I like just jogging casually with him throughout the beautiful environments, it is a bit jarring to return to after having experienced the fast hover boots. The hover boots also return in this game, and they're at their best here. I like how you can gradually charge up to achieve a super fast boost, and the trajectory can be easily redirected in mid-air, which wasn't possible in other games. It's wonderful that most of the levels are designed with these babies in mind, still managing to take long to clear, despite how fast you can move. Some levels also take advantage of the grind boots, and these sections have never been more exhilarating. They make for some of the best set pieces in the game, especially the one where Rivet and Clank try not to get killed by the Fixer on Torrent 4, and actually grind on top of the Fixer himself. It's pretty wild. These traversal options make for some incredible movement, and the level design often incorporates them, sometimes even combines them, which is so satisfying. I do wish that wall running would carry momentum from hoverbooting and grinding though, that would make combined sections even cooler. They also brought back grav leaping from Into the Nexus, which I was very surprised to see, pleasantly so. It's so cool to do and really adds to the atmosphere of Blizzard Prime and Cordelion. When Kadaro Station got filled with water, I was initially excited for a return to swimming, but got even more excited when it was revealed to be a grav leaping section underwater. It's such an awesome concept. That level has such a fantastic atmosphere, making for surprisingly effective horror with the Jew segments, and the whole underwater base theme gave me major Aquados from Upper Arsenal vibes. There's also some creature traversal with Speedles and Trudy, the former being really good, but the latter being really bad. It's fun to ride Speedles that are faster than hoverboots and can traverse acidic surfaces to get to places. They can even be ridden on some well-designed courses that utilize the interdimensional gimmick, seamlessly transitioning from one area to another. Flying with Trudy on the other hand actually sucks, which I did not expect whatsoever. For one, you can't control her with the left analog stick, as you usually can with just about everything else, and that also means there's no camera controls besides the direction you're steering in. That made controlling Trudy quite cumbersome, and while it is nice being able to fly freely within Sargasso, I missed the way smoother robo-wings from Tools of Destruction while doing that. There's also this ridiculous requirement that you need to collect at least 45 SERP stones for Trudy to be able to shoot. It's not that stupid in concept, but the game doesn't even tell you about it, so I was confused trying to dive into the out-of-reach SERP stones when you can only get them by shooting at them. Why was flight unlocked at 30 SERP stones then, or why didn't firing also unlock then? It's such a horrible design, on top of Trudy already not controlling that well, so anything involving Trudy is easily the worst part of the game. It's a good thing it's a minor part of the game, but I really wish that flying was fun, as it looked so cool in the trailers. While you can't ride her, you can control a robot named Glitch, who Ratchet deploys to hack into systems and destroy viruses. She controls pretty smoothly, and I like how she speeds up as you move. The layouts of the levels are pretty cool, being able to crawl up walls and roofs, and the shooting feels pretty good. These sections are really easy, but they're nice, and I was surprised to find out that they have their own little overarching story, even when the last couple of sections are related to getting optional gold bolts. Of course, you control Clank too, as well as Kit at one point, and their sections are really good for Clank standards. They have some pretty interesting puzzles, and the aesthetics are super pleasing to the eye. While they can punch and spin attack, there's no combat, which I kind of miss, but the puzzles are good enough on their own to be worthwhile. These are nowhere near as good as the Clank sections from A Crack in Time, which still remain peak, but they're some of the better ones from the series, so I'll take them. The game has some optional areas in the form of pocket dimensions that look really cool and feed into the interdimensional gimmick. These are all pretty brief, but they're short and sweet, with some fun and creative designs, like platforming between crates and extended wall running sequences. You find an armor piece at the end of each, which is a neat reward. The armor system in this game is great, since there are so many customization options, allowing you to mix and match different armor pieces, and even choose between a variety of colors for each of them. This is what RNC really needed for its armor system, since in most of the games you can't change back to previous armors, meaning Ratchet's head won't be visible because of helmets. Here you can actually wear the Carbonox armor without the helmet, which is such a nice option to have. Personally though, I prefer wearing the helmet, since I absolutely adore the Carbonox, and I'm so glad they brought it back. Most of the other armors look really good too, and those that don't can be improved with a swap of a color. I think it's time to touch on the combat, and honestly, it's the best it has ever been. Yes, it even beats Deadlocked in that regard, and that game was mainly focused on combat. Like I said earlier, the Phantom Dash adds a lot to it, as it makes the combat more dynamic, being able to quickly dodge in every direction to avoid enemy attacks. The hover boots can also be incorporated, since the transition from it to combat and vice versa feels very natural, plus you can use the wrench or hammer while hover booting. Several encounters also allow you to teleport between positions with the Rift Tether, which is a good way to move across the battlefield. As for the actual gunplay, using the weapons to kill enemies feels incredibly satisfying, thanks in large part to the DualSense controller, due to its adaptive triggers and haptic feedback. It allows for some of the weapons to have various uses, like firing slowly or rapidly with the burst pistol, using 1 or 2 barrels with the Enforcer, and deploying your shield with the Void Repulsor or shooting it out depending on how hard you hold the trigger. This makes the weapons more thrilling to use than they would have been otherwise, so even though certain weapons like Mr. Fungi, the Glove of Doom, and the Bombardier are very similar and therefore a bit redundant, the selection of weapons might be the best in the series. There are 20 of them, so it's tied for having the second biggest roster alongside Up Your Arsenal, and has 4 fewer than Going Commando. I wish some of the weapons from those games returned, and the Glove of Doom and Bouncer do, but that's solely because they were an RNC PS4. The Buzzblades, Warmonger, and Pixelizer also return, because they also were in that game, and 2 of those are overused at this point. At least Mr. Zircon isn't a weapon anymore, but the Zircons are characters, so it might not have been such a good trade-off after all. Anyhow, the Lightning Rod actually heavily reminds me of the Plasma Coil. It's therefore a top 3 weapon of this game, even though it's definitely not as good. I also love the Ricochet, which you have to time yourself in order to make it strike repeatedly. I wish its upgrade would come with multiple balls, but it's still amazing the way it is. Then there's the Riftia New One 8, or Infinite, which is so refreshing after the copy-pasted music playing minigun rhinos. This one opens up rifts, as is to be expected from this game, and drops a bunch of stuff, including references to other games. I was actually spoiled on its functionality, which I would be upset about, but the way Insomniac revealed it on social media was more than worth it. They began referencing Sunset Overdrive, My Boy Sly Cooper, Uncharted, and lastly Horizon, which led to a video of the Rhino 8 opening a rift and dropping a goddamn Thunderjaw on an enemy. My hype levels were through the roof with this chain of tweets, it was unreal. So the Rhino 8 can drop Horizon machines, Uncharted vehicles, Fizzy from Sunset Overdrive, Jak and Daxter themselves, Sly, Bentley, and the Cooper van. What an awesome selection of references to some of my favorite games. Rift Apart and Astro's Playroom are already PS5 only games obsessed with referencing a bunch of PlayStation IPs, and I don't want this trend to stop. This isn't my favorite Rhino, but I dig it, and again, it's so refreshing to finally have the Rhino do something different again. So, the DualSense really adds a lot to the gunplay, and everything else to be honest, so Rift Apart is a fantastic example of incorporating the PS5's capabilities, making it feel like a true next-gen experience, and it's not limited to the controller. The Rift Tether already takes advantage of the SSD's insanely quick load times, and so does the dimension hopping, which instantly transitions between different areas. Some bosses, for instance, will suddenly throw you into new locations, making them feel very dynamic, and that interdimensional section near the beginning is still such an unreal set piece. There are also some levels where you hit Blizon crystals to change the look of them. This made Cordelion, and especially Blizar Prime, incredible and unique, basically packing 2 levels in one. There's even a grind rail section that incorporates this gimmick, and it's mesmerizing. Blizar Prime might actually be the best level in the whole franchise, it's so unbelievably good. But I think I love Savali just a tad bit more. I love me some free roam levels in RNC, and Savali might be the best the series has to offer. It's bigger than the rest, but it's still compacted enough to not be overbearing, especially since this is where you get the hover boots, so traversing the map is no issue. There are so many things to do, with new ideas that spices things up, and the main objective is amazing as well, especially when you hoverboot against time limits. This is also where you meet Best Bot Girl Kit, and I love hearing the conversations between her and Ratchet as they explore the planet. You also find the Lorbs here, giving you some nice pieces of Lombax lore and PlayStation references. You even return to this place at nighttime, mixing up the atmosphere and killing awesome undead enemies, including a Grunthor miniboss, and exploring the catacombs is so cool. I also want to give a shout out to Ardolus, which I noticed having a similar layout to the Tools of Destruction version, but also mixes things up by going through a fun theme park and a balls to the wall pirate ship section. That set piece reminded me of the ship section from God of War PS4 and Helheim, which was also really dope, but I find the gameplay of Rift Apart much better, so this was an absolute treat. I do wish that you fought the Kraken in the end though, it would have been a nice cherry on top after such an explosive segment. Furthermore, I wish you could play as Giant Kit, and Giant Clank for that matter. That would have been an awesome return to that sort of gameplay. I imagine it would have made the final boss even better, which I was hoping would be more interdimensional, like the boss fight against regular Dr. Nefarious, which was my favorite boss fight in the game. Emperor Nefarious was a great fight too, but could have been better considering the scale of the finale. Other bosses were pretty good too, the combat is incredible after all. On that topic, the arena made a return, and while I'm not the biggest fan of them, I do appreciate them being there. This arena isn't among the best, but it was still really fun to clear the challenges, and I like that some of them were Speedle related. I wish there were some hoverboot ones like in Into the Nexus though. As you can see, Rift Apart has lots of content for an RNC game, and it took me a whole 16 hours to complete my first playthrough. I'm sure it'll get shorter on replays, but it still seems to be the longest game in the series, with Going Commando and A Crack in Time taking me about 10 to 12 hours to complete nowadays. That's how long it took me to complete challenge mode, and New Game Plus always takes way less time, so for it to take that long is really promising. I was fearing the game would end at certain points, but was glad when it kept going, and while it was bittersweet to finish, I'm very satisfied with the length. There might not have been that many different levels, but most of them were really long, and I enjoyed them so much, so I didn't mind. Even though no planets from the Solano or Bogon galaxies returned sadly, Rift Apart's levels felt like a return to the classic level formula that have branching paths, and that, combined with amazing combat like in Deadlocked, and fantastic traversal like in A Crack in Time, made for a perfect recipe. Overall, the gameplay of Rift Apart is absolutely phenomenal, and among the best RNC has to offer. It improves on traversal and combat, and contributes with some neat additions. The levels are really long, but so exceptional that it's more of a positive than anything, and they're packed with thrilling set pieces. Most of the Maxi games are amazing too, even though everything involving Trudy sucks. While I hesitate to put its gameplay over A Crack in Times, due to the inferior Clank and Flight sections, it's pretty much on par, and it's definitely a 10 out of 10 in that regard, 9.75 at the least.
The dimensions are weakening considerably. How bad is it?
Rift Apart is gorgeous. It might just be the prettiest game I've ever witnessed, and I used performance with ray tracing mode. That mode is amazing by the way, since it not only allows a mostly stable 60 frames per second, but also ray tracing, meaning all light reflects naturally. Just look at Clank, isn't he beautiful? There's so much detail put into every environment and model, and the amount of life is staggering. There are so many ships in the sky, so many inhabitants walking by, and so many enemies that can die. It's visual poetry. The visuals are so varied too, with varying degrees of dark and light, and Nefarious City in particular blends both so well together. The amount of neon within the darkness makes for an awesome cyberpunk look, and heavily reminds me of Underworld Coruscant from Star Wars. The planet named Coruscant even sounds similar, so it must have been intentional. Blizzard Prime obviously has a lot of contrast too, shifting between dark purple space aesthetics to a bright orange industrial area. It's surely the prettiest looking planet in the game. Cordelion also shifts between dark and light, giving a haunting atmosphere within an underwater base, similar to that of BioShock. The pocket dimensions are also really pretty and surreal looking, with floating remnants from the levels you're in. The glitch areas are pretty cool too, their designs actually remind me of the Great Clock. Definitely not as fancy, but I like the familiarity. Clank sections especially look so beautiful with the glowing pink, elevating those sections beyond just the fun gameplay. The set pieces are also damn impressive, especially when utilizing the SSD, leading to some of the most insane moments I've experienced in a game. A widespread issue with RNC PS4 was that while some of the cutscene animations were really solid, some were just super lifeless. That's not the case for Rift Apart however, which has fluid animation in just about every scene, and it really does look early Pixar or DreamWorks level. The faces are so expressive, even on the robots, and the bodies have plenty of movement too. The animations during gameplay add to how good the gameplay feels, and there's so much detail put into them. Just look at Clank and Kit struggling from fans and being compressed by gravity. There's so much personality to be found. The hover boots look terrific, giving off these stunning beams of blue, and of course the weapons are attractive too. Character models are on point for the most part, Rivet and Kit in particular looking really cute, and Emperor Nefarious being such an awesome redesign of the Doctor. I love how his color palette is used for most of his lackeys, and even the ship, making them look so cool. While Dr. Nefarious's design does look a bit weird, I have grown accustomed to it. Ratchet's design however still seems a bit kiddish, and his fur sticks out a bit in a weird way. There's like one frame of him where I absolutely adore his design, and I wish his model was more akin to that of a Kraken Times. Quark looks a lot better than he did in All for One to Into the Nexus, Skid looks better than he did in RNC PS4, and Rusty Pete looks roughly the same as usual, which is good. Their alternate dimension counterparts look good too, and while Captain Quantum looks a bit jarring, I think that was intentional, making him look like a comic book character, which is a neat touch. Returning enemies from previous games look great, though it does feel like Insomniac were a bit lazy, given that most of them were ripped straight from the PS4 game. That said, it doesn't really matter much in the grand scheme of things, some of them are at least recolored, and if it reduced crunch time, then that's great. It's wonderful to hear developers coming out to say they weren't overworked, and I wouldn't want to attack them for that. That said, this is a critical review, and I do have to criticize the things that don't work that well, so that the developers can make an even better product next time. While there's so much attention to detail, I did notice certain things not looking very detailed whatsoever, and certain things that should react to the player's movements don't. I don't really take much issue with this, it by no means ruins my experience, but it reduces the immersion, so it's worth addressing. I encountered quite a few glitches on my playthrough, and 3 crashes overall. 2 of those only crashed the game, but the third actually crashed my PS5, causing it to blink white lights, which really terrified me. PS5s are invaluable, so if it already broke after only a month of owning it, that would have been terrible. Fortunately though, it wasn't anything serious and it still works. As for the glitches, one of them is ironically enough related to glitch. You see, I did the optional one on our dough list to unlock the gold bolt, and it still said I could do another one, so I did just that. However, that meant I couldn't unlock the gold bolt where I was supposed to do the last glitch section, so I had to get that one in challenge mode. There are also some instances where you just randomly die or clip through things, and the things summoned by the Rhino 8 also clip a bunch, plus it often just won't deal damage, which kind of defeats its purpose. Some of these glitches could very well be patched up, and it seems Insomniac already did, but as I'm writing this script, there are some glitches to look out for, big and small. I touched a bit on the voice acting already, saying I'm not a fan of how Ratchet talks in this game, Clank sounding a bit off as well, and of course Quark sadly having to change voice actor. I noticed Rusty Pete also sounds different, but he barely talks anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I did say I liked the more low-key performance of Skid and Phantom though, and that Mags the Lombax was pleasing to the ears, and overall, the voice work is great. Unsurprisingly, Armin Shimmerman killed it again as Dr. Nefarious, and Robin Atkin Downes did a great job differentiating Emperor Nefarious. Jennifer Hale made Rivet very likable, and Deborah Wilson made me sympathize with Kit quite a bit. Pierre and Quantum also sounded pretty good, and Gary sounded very friendly. I quite like alternate dimension Miss Zircon's voice, but my god, I can't stand listening to Zircon Jr. Please don't interpret this as an attack on Richard Horvitz. He's great at what he does, and I've enjoyed some of his other roles, but man, I honestly find this Zircon Jr. more grating than Stuart Sergo.
The ricochet! Pull the fire trigger to shoot it at your useless enemy! Oh my! And then it will pop back up next to them! Then what? Pull the fire trigger to hit them again! And again! And again! Bing, bing, bing!
It really doesn't help that he's the arena commentator. I would have taken Mr. Zircon instead, to be honest. Lastly, there's the soundtrack, which was another aspect I was skeptical of. I did have some hope for it though, seeing as Mark Mothersbaugh composed it instead of Michael Bross, meaning a break from the style of RNC soundtracks from the last decade that I found dull. While I wouldn't say it's as good as David Berchot's compositions, this one is actually pretty good. Sure, I didn't really notice much of the music, but the ones that slap really slap. The glitch theme was the first time I truly noticed the music, and it's quite the banger, sounding all electronic and mystical. My favorite track, however, has to be the grindrail section of Blizzard Prime. This theme slaps so hard, especially in the dark dimension, but it's so cool that it changes depending on the dimension you're in. Some other tracks were cool too, like the rocky one on Savali. And the one with the choir. While not one of my favorites, this soundtrack is better than I expected, so I'm quite satisfied with it. I prefer it over a Crack in Time Space soundtrack, though the Space Radio does put it just above Rift Apart's. Overall, the presentation of this game is next level. The environments and character models are beautiful and detailed, and there are so many insane set pieces scattered throughout the game. The PS5's SSD adds a lot to that, and the performance manages to keep up with the chaos for the most part. The voice acting is overall great, and so is the soundtrack, which is more than I expected. I do unfortunately have some problems with some of the voice acting, and the game contains a bunch of glitches, even game-breaking ones. That said, the presentation is easily a strong 9, and proves to be a true next-gen experience.
I think you know.
Is that us?
While I was super hyped for Rift Apart, I was skeptical to some of its aspects, and even though it does have some elements I feared that it would, I was overall extremely satisfied with this game. The writing is pretty good, with an interesting story, fun dialogue, and likable characters, especially the newcomers Rivet and Kit, and I'm glad Emperor Nefarious balanced out Dr. Nefarious's absurdity. The gameplay is some of the best the series has to offer, having the best Ratchet and Rivet traversal and combat, really good Clank and Kit sections, great maxi games, some incredible levels, cool boss fights, and fantastic use of the DualSense controller's functionalities. The game also takes tremendous use of the PS5's SSD, making for crazy set pieces with fast loading speeds, and everything looks absolutely gorgeous, truly making it feel next gen. The voice acting is really good, and the soundtrack is better than I expected. As for negatives, there is still cringe dialogue, and given that characters often talk, there's plenty of it, sadly. I'm also not a fan of how Ratchet was handled, feeling out of character and taking a back seat to the new ones. While the gameplay is practically flawless, everything involving Trudy sticks out like a sore thumb due to awkward controls and stupid designs. Even though the game looks phenomenal, there are some things that could have used more detail, and there are some glitches that hamper the experience. Finally, some of the voice acting doesn't sit quite right with me, and much of the music still goes unnoticed. All in all though, Rift Apart is amazing, with each aspect coming together to form an awesome next-gen, interdimensional adventure that you won't want to miss. If you have a PS5, then this is the game to go with, and if you're a Ratchet & Clank fan, I guess it depends on what you want from the games, but at least the gameplay should satisfy immensely. It might surprise skeptics, as was the case for me, who expected it to be my 7th favorite RNC, but I think it's actually my number 4, being sandwiched in between Uppy Arsenal and the original. It could very well climb up to 3rd place, and I do think it's the 3rd best game in the series on a critical level. I'm giving Rift Apart the rating of 9.25 out of 10, and it's so close to reaching 9.5, which is the score I gave to my favorite video game, going Commando. It's such an improvement over the PS4 game in just about every field, and it's no doubt the best RNC game since A Crack in Time from 2009. It seems this decade will be much better for RNC than the last decade was, and that's exciting to think about. Just like the announcement of Rift Apart was a fantastic early birthday present, the release of the game was also a fantastic early birthday present, and it gave me plenty of fun over the following days. So, to those that have played it, what did you think of Rift Apart? I'd be interested to know. I'm Arcadon, and hopefully, you'll see me next time!